Welcome back to just another solar podcast with Beattie, that's me, and Karl Jensen.
Hey Luke, how you doing?
Good. So Smart Energy was a success in Sydney. Great to catch up with everyone, but also seemed to be a super spreader event.
Yeah, I did really well, Luke. I'm as tough as they come. Barely had anything other than a couple of sweaty nights, but the rest of the family, it hit them pretty hard, and they're still sick 2 weeks later.
It's been quite a big week with the mandatory enforcement of the new AS 5033. Everything online's blown up, lots of conversations and phone calls. So it's really, really good timing to have our special guest today, who is a head trainer at Energy Training Group. He's the spokesperson for standards for solar cutters and former colleague of ours too, Karl, Brendan Laidlaw, aka Knackers. Welcome aboard.
How you doing, guys?
Thanks for coming, Brendan.
Just before we jumped online, you noted that it's quite entertaining to see how much it's blown up online on solar cutters and everything else. The draft standards were out for a while. The standards were published last year. They've been mandatory in New South Wales for a while. So what's your take?
I do find it entertaining. We've had a 6-month grace period for most of the country. And on the day they become mandatory, everyone shits themselves and starts thinking about it. I think people that were more organised were thinking about it a little bit longer, a couple of months ago. So, at Energy Training Group, we're attached to a solar contractor as well called Online Air and Solar. And we've been operating under the new standards for pretty much since about February, maybe late January. And we wanted to get on early to try and, flush out any issues. That's not to say we caught everything, and I didn't catch anything. I wrote a blog early this year as well to address the new standards. I think I caught nearly all the issues, but I did miss the 1.25 multiplier that's got everyone shitting themselves in the last couple of days.
So just to give an explanation on that, we're talking about the maximum short circuit current rating of the inverters.
Yeah.
So give a quick explanation first and then jump into the issue if you could.
So essentially the new 5833 states that you need to size the input of your PCE, your inverter, has to be sized to 1.25 times ISC of your module. Most of your inverters really have a 15 amp input, and most panels on the market are 12.5 amps plus. Everything that's come out with the new big wafers, they're all over 12.5 amps. So as soon as you're over 12 amps, you times that by 1.25, you are over 15 amps. You are exceeding the inverter input, apparently, and technically it's not compliant. From a non-standards point of view, it seems ridiculous. Short circuit current really doesn't need to be considered because it's not, when the inverter's operating, it's not exposed to short circuit current for a start. You're exposed to operating current.
So Brendan, in regards to that, my personal opinion, the only time that the inverter is exposed to that short circuit current is if it's fucking blown up.
Yeah, it's already on fire by that point. So, you're not protecting
already
against
on
anything.
fire.
They seem to be creating rules to protect against fault conditions that I can't imagine how they can occur. They're protecting against something that won't happen.
And if it does happen, it's already blown up.
Yeah.
And it's already on fire.
Yeah. An inverter does an insulation resistance test every 20 minutes, right? It's detecting if there's less than 5 megohms to earth. At a dead short, it's ridiculous. That particular rule, and I think the earthing rule that's changed, they've been the two really crappy rules in the new standards.
So practically, though, the inverters affected SunGrow, Goodwe, both 15 amp limits, Grow Watts at 16 amps. Interesting to mention that, some of the sales tactics against Fronius have been as an old inverter since 2013, but that old workhorse has 18 amps, so they're not impacted. If this isn't resolved and you were to add up the value of all of the stock in country of SunGrow, Goodwe, Grow Watt, and a bunch of the other affected inverters, it's enormous. And if you look at the impact of companies that potentially won't be able to install their current inventory and their current quotes in what's been a terrible market, the flow-on effects from there.
We're talking millions of dollars here, millions of dollars worth of stock spread across dozens of different wholesalers. You've got stock that's been supplied to customers. And of course, the elephant in the room is New South Wales, where there hasn't been any alarm bells rung from those guys. And if I'm not mistaken, New South Wales is the second largest market next to Queensland. So there's been no one throwing their arms in the air in New South Wales saying, hey, this is a problem. So I'm thinking that there's actually a lot of gear that's installed in New South Wales that doesn't comply. And we know that they don't have 100% inspections. And if they do have inspections, they're often 6, 9, 12 months down the line. So potentially we've got operators exposed to breaches of 5033, which means that ORA can come back and say, well, they're not eligible for STCs, and we're going to have to go back to site, remove inverters that are otherwise perfectly good and replace them with different inverters.
Which is ludicrous.
Well, not only is it ludicrous, but it's spectacularly expensive.
I do think there's a workaround.
We're all ears.
Yep. So if you're looking, and I've got the standards up in front of me just to give me a hand while I'm looking at this. So 4.2.2.2, we're looking at, everyone's concentrating on the without PV string overcurrent protect installed issue, which is the 1.25. Under that same section in the table, there is a section for PV string overcurrent protection provided. And then you base it on the size of the overcurrent protection. So we could put 15 amp fuses on all these panels, and it would then comply.
It seems like a backward step to go back to string fuse in them.
Yeah. This is the gift that keeps on giving.
Yeah.
Brendan. So way back in the day with Energy Matters, they had an engineer, I've forgotten his name, but he used to specify a 12 amp fuse with a 6 amp panel. And we went back to thousands of jobs to replace those fuses at 3 years, and then we replaced them again at 6 years, and it cost a fortune.
So it's not a perfect solution, but it is a solution if people have inventory.
It's all if you want to be compliant, unless there's some sort of tech note or some sort of exemption or something that comes out, the only way I can see anyone complying and using existing inventory is to put in string overcurrent protection.
But if we're talking a 15 amp fuse on a 13 amp panel, Brendan, this is a 2-year solution, and we're replacing the fuses. The systems are going down. We've got to go back, replace fuses every 2 years. And customer expects these days that these systems are going to last for the 10-year installation warranty, and that's a lot of callbacks.
Distinct possibility. Maybe leave the customer with 10 fuses on the way out. Show them how to swap them over.
At least in this scenario, I'm hoping that we're going to put the string fusing adjacent to the inverter, and sure as shit, not on the roof.
Oh, definitely. I mean, the new standard actually very strongly hints you towards putting all string protection adjacent to inverters now.
They did something right. It's great.
Yeah. So if you want to abolish the RTI, if you want to have no rooftop isolator, you must have your string protection adjacent to the inverter. As soon as you put string protection at the rooftop, you now require a rooftop isolator. So given that, I don't think anyone's ever going to install string protection on the rooftop ever again, because why would you spend the extra money on isolators when all you got to do is move your string protection to next to the inverter, and then you've solved your problem. So
the commercial guys that are installing inline fuses to avoid the 25 millimeter squared earth conductor to the inverter, they're installing inline fuses adjacent to the inverter. Where are we putting these things in the tray? Because they're not small.
I've written a blog on that on our website as well. I did a cost analysis.
We'll put a post in the notes as well for this podcast. So just check the notes, and there'll be a link to this blog that Brendan's talking about.
I had a chat to Rick from PV Connections, and we did a little cost analysis between inline fuses or DIN mount fuses in a box. And it turns out that DIN mount fuses in a box are going to be a cheaper solution. I expect everyone, like on a commercial job, unless you've got an inverter with built-in fusing, then you've obviously solved your problem. You don't have to do anything. But other than that, you're going to put a box next to the inverter and just put DIN mount fuses in a box.
The thing that I can only raise the alarm bell there is, all of a sudden we've got cables coming out of an open conduit into an enclosure that's got these DIN mount fuse holders, and then we've got loose cables coming out of that into the inverter. The thing really does, we're back into octopus shit sandwich stuff.
Yeah, it's a shit solution. I mean, ideally you just wouldn't have to do it, but when it comes down to cost, and everyone's going to do it because they don't want to run a 25 mil up to their array and then pull it. If you're running a 100 kilowatt SunGrow inverter, you're going to have to put a 25 mil earth to every rail.
I don't know.
Do it.
Brendan, I reckon that, back in the day, I used to specify, when we sold Sunlock, we used to specify a Sunlock channel that ran across the top of your landscape rails, and that would equipotentially bond the whole array, and you would only have one 25 mil cable that runs from the inverter to that one rail, and then everything else was earthed off that.
Yes. Sunlock did it, right? And Sunlock was compliance. There's no reason you couldn't do it with any other rail manufacturer. They just have to sort of build some sort of foot that has, the little pins in it or something like that. So it earths a weave underneath it, something like that.
Yeah.
There's no reason why that couldn't be done, but it's not going to help anyone in the next 6 months because you know how long it takes a new product to get to market.
Coming back to the example of New South Wales, while we're talking about cables, so since they've been mandatory with the AS 5033, how much 1,000-volt cable has been going out there? So obviously now it needs to be 1,500 volts rated and needs that IEC rating. Are they going to be picking up on that as well?
Look, I would hope that common sense prevails in that no one's been allowed to exceed 600 volts. So the reason we had to change to the new cable was because 5033 said that we can now do 1,500 volt arrays. In residential, because it contradicts AS 4777, no one's been able to exceed 600 volts on a residential array anyway. So the cable we had before for 600 volt arrays is still perfectly safe now in 600 volt arrays. Nothing has changed. I mean, you would hope common sense prevails. You can never be confident the bureaucracy will make a good decision. There's a famous one there, Brendan. When I was back in the aviation days, well, a very smart guy that I used to work for said there's absolutely nothing common about common sense. Yeah. Yeah. It's not unsafe, you know what I mean? There's nothing unsafe about not having the new cable in place.
Same issue as the inverters. There's millions and millions of dollars worth of the 4 mil 1,000-volt twin cable around the country. So been chatting to other wholesalers, importers, and installers and contractors, and there is an enormous amount. So I know there's a push to get some sort of exemption or grace period to keep doing it. And if common sense prevails, until you can go to 1,000 volts for residential, and AS 4777 is not going to be updated tomorrow, surely there can be some sort of exemption. And similarly, I know Glenn Morris, I believe, wrote to ERAC regarding the inverters and to get some sort of exemption or common sense there. But to get the standard changed again is a 2 to 3 year process. So it requires ERAC and the local regulators, both on the cable and the inverters, to come out and give some sort of allowance. Now, it seems that here we are cap in hand again to ERAC, like when there was issues with the internal DC ISOs in the inverters. And on that note, for inverter manufacturers, if you are still working off an interim certificate, the deadline's coming up. You need to get your testing sorted, listed with the CEC, because the last bloody thing we need is another hard deadline that's going to impact the industry. So, Brendan, you mentioned a blog that you did and you've been doing training. Is there anything else that you've picked up? I mean, we've discussed the big ones that have blown up online. What else have you seen there that's worth mentioning?
I mean, everyone seems to have managed this pretty easy, but if they're not aware, the way you've got to run your DC conduits had changed. You've got to be 600 mil off the ceiling at all times now, unless you're within the exclusion zones that are close to the external walls of the building. But that's just changes the way you work. It's not like it's the end of the world. It's products that kill people, because you can't solve the issue by just moving your conduit 600 mil. So that's the other thing that I've brought up with a few guys. The whole drain device thing, having open conduits and drain devices and stuff like that. I mean, I know when the standard first came out, they drew this drain device, and I sent pictures of the drain device from the standard to, MIDIs, AWM, EV connections, all of, the guys that do that sort of stuff. Like, any of you guys ever seen one of these things before? They're like, Brendan, I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. This is, so some bloke just drew it into the standard, just invented it by drawing a picture in the standard. And it seems like a few people have, gotten on it now and they've got a drain device.
I think it's a T-piece, a reducer, and just a drainage plug, really. Yeah,
it's not a big deal. It's a good change to the standard, to be honest. Like, most of the fires that were occurring in DC isolators would actually occur in the isolator next to the inverter, not the one at the rooftop, because the water gets in up the roof, but then it runs down the conduit and it ends up inside the ground isolator. Or I've seen a lot of furnaces where, the whole bottom of it full of water because someone's done, a nice neat job, brought their conduit into the bottom of the inverter, but the water's getting up at the rooftop and then it ends up in the inverter. And I've seen more than one furnace that's a melted mess on the wall because of that situation.
Yeah, look, I've always said to people, Brendan, with inverters that they're terminating the conduit, aka the hose from the roof, that they should open up those at least one of those holes where you're intended to push a cable through. If you run a drill through one of those, then at least the water comes in. It'll flow out, run out through the bottom of the inverter.
It was one of the nonsense things in solar. Like, I did my apprenticeship in commercial electrical, and I was always taught to put a hole in the lowest point in my conduit. That was what I was taught in my apprenticeship. That's just basic electrical trade skills.
No,
right?
bullshit. Come on.
That's what I was
That's
taught.
ridiculous, Brendan.
When I was a child, I was taught that when I was an 18-year-old apprentice. And then I used to do that. When I first started in solar, I would like put a hole, and then all of a sudden I was getting pinged by inspectors. They're telling me you're affecting the IP rating. I'm like, I'm fucking what? What do you mean? Like, I'm just doing common sense. I'm putting a hole in the lowest point of the conduit so no water can get in. I will say that I didn't comply with the regs because back in the day I used to hide it. I used to drill a little hole in the back of the conduit and then saddle it in such a way that you couldn't see that I'd left a hole in it. And none of my
Good job, Brendan. Good job.
But it was effective, right? The water's got somewhere to go that's not an isolator or the inverter.
Yeah, well, I mean, nothing's airtight as well. You know, like no underground conduit in the world is not full of water after it's been there for 10 years because hot, moist air goes down the conduit and then it gets cold and then it turns into condensation. And over time, all underground conduits fill with water. That's just the reality. And I can't, unless you've got your conduit from your rooftop to your inverter like fucking airtight, how are you going to stop that same thing from occurring? What are you going to do, back it down?
So, Brendan, what actually happens in those, now you've tweaked my curiosity. What happens in those scenarios where you've got buried conduit that's full of water? Is it actually a problem?
No, cable's waterproof. It's fine. It stays nice and cool.
Oh, so we've just provided a heat transfer medium from the cable to the external dirt. That's all you've
done. Yeah. I mean, as long as there's no nicks in the cable, so it's going to be fine. You're not going to have any issues. Well, the issue is water getting into an isolator. In an isolator, you've got exposed terminals.
Yeah.
And that's an issue. Yeah, you don't want water there. But in a conduit with cable in it, does anyone care if it's full of water? No. Doesn't make a difference.
Then the only thing that the conduit's providing then is a bit of extra mechanical protection, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, that's why we have mechanical protection on DC cables because we can't put a breaker on it. Breaker protects cable, but unfortunately, because solar's a current limited source, we can't use a breaker. It won't trip.
So wouldn't the same apply when we're talking about these string fuses for inverters and the 1.25 ISC thing? You know, once again, we're a current limited source. But if we put a string fuse that's rated only a couple of amps higher than the constant current, then, you know, I've said this before and others have criticised my analogy of them being like a light bulb. But, you know, if you cut open a HRC fuse, there's a fat bit, a skinny bit, a fat bit, a skinny bit, rinse, repeat. The whole thing is sitting in what looks like sand. And ultimately, if you make that thing hot all the time, even if it's close to its rating, it will break. And I think the sand's there to, once the arc flash happens, so the fuse breaks, there's an arc inside the HRC fuse, and I think that sand turns into glass, which then stops the arc. That's my understanding of how they work.
That is exactly how they work, Karl. That's what it's for.
Now, another flashpoint, no pun intended. So with DCUs, or more specifically optimizers, with the new standards, there's some issues. SolarEdge has released something about it. The current advice for TIG optimizers, Huawei optimizers, is that you should put in string fuse in. Once again, that seems like a backward step.
So it's not about to do with current, it's to do with voltage. Basically, the standard says that rather than usually, you know, when you calculate, so usually you calculate max string voltage based on the max VOC of a panel and the expected lowest temperature it's going to be exposed to. Where DC optimizers are involved, you're meant to take the maximum voltage the optimizer can put out as its highest expected voltage. Now, initially, I thought that was going to be a big issue for SolarEdge because some of their optimizers are rated to 80 volts. And if you can only go to 600 volts, you're doing strings of 8. you're doing strings of, 8 or 9, and then you hit your 600 volt limit. There is an exemption, the IEC, I can't remember the number off the top, and I think I've got it here, IEC 62548, which I haven't read that standard. I had to get this from somebody else. One of the killers in the new standard is always references to IEC. They're expensive. I have access to Australian standards, but not IEC standards. So it's a bit of a pain in the arse.
Well, this raises a new question, Brendan, and that is, we lead the world in this. Why isn't the rest of the world following the sorts of things that we're learning in Australia? We've got more penetration per capita population than anywhere in the world.
We're going the other way, aren't we? We're surrendering control to the IEC rather than just creating an Australian standard and leading the way. But yeah, so with Solar Edge, that IEC standard basically says that if the inverter controls the voltage of the string, then you go by the maximum voltage that the inverter will allow. So a Solar Edge inverter controls its optimizers. It won't let them get to a voltage that exceeds the maximum voltage. So Solar Edge is fine. There's an exemption. I spoke to Tego about it, and Tego basically said, well, we're just going to change our spec sheets, right? Because the standard says that you're meant to refer to what is the highest expected voltage from the optimizer. And Tego's response to me was, well, Tego doesn't do a buck or a boost. It doesn't actually adjust voltage. It does this thing called impedance matching. So it sort of just routes current around shaded panels rather than doing a buck boost that the Solar Edge optimizer does. So they're saying, well, the Tego won't put out a higher voltage than the VOC of the panel.
I agree.
So well, that's how the Tego works at the end of the day. There's nothing, it's physics.
Well,
there's nothing to argue about.
It sacrifices voltage for current. So it tries very hard to boost the current of the module up to the current of the rest of the string. And in doing so, sacrifices a shitload of voltage.
Yeah, so it will never output a higher voltage than VOC of the panel.
Correct.
It doesn't do a boost. It only does a buck. Therefore, they basically just told me, well, we're just going to change our spec sheets and just say output voltage will never exceed VOC.
So I don't know if you have an answer, but what would be the motivation for them to change the standard around DCUs and to bring this stuff in?
Well, the one thing I'm not across is the Huawei optimizer. I don't know how they work. I mean, if they work the same way as Tego, they can do the exact same thing.
I think there was a bit of talk, Brendan, that there was some patent infringements with Solar Edge there at some point. So it's fair to say that it does buck and boost.
But if it's controlled by the inverter, then the IEC exemption stands. So essentially, the way I see it, the clauses around optimizers don't actually apply to any products in the Australian market. So you may as well just dismiss them and not worry about them.
And let's move on to Enphase.
I think Enphase have been quite brave in just giving themselves an exemption to the reg. So the letter of the law, I think their reasoning is flawed. But if they get away with it, good for them. At the end of the day, I'm not going to begrudge them. But they're saying that our single panel is connected in parallel to my inverter. What does that even mean?
They went down to the definition of a string, and the string is multiple panels in series.
I was actually talking about this on the Cutters chat today, and the reg actually says a string is one or more panels in series.
Right.
That's the wording in the reg. So the way I read that is that one panel counts as a string because it does specifically say one or more panels in series. I mean, if Enphase can get away with putting out a tech note and that gets them, they just give themselves an exemption and it works for them, good for Enphase.
Let's take a step back and say that the purpose of standards is safety. I don't think bringing the ring around Enphase and strangling them is really justified if safety is the ultimate goal.
Oh, look, let's not hold any punches back, mate. A string of one panel. Damn. We've got some potential for some crazy disasters here. I mean, come on.
But I don't think that clause is making anything safer. Like at the end of the day, the current from one panel is the same as the current from a string of 20 panels. It's at a higher voltage in a string of 20 panels, but the current's the same.
Which begs the question, why?
Exactly.
Well, look, at the end of the day, you and I both know. I mean, Brendan, you said that you represent the Cutters on the standards committee. Is that right?
Just recently, that's become like official. So
Jack said today that the official thing is that you're the spokesman for the standards for the solar Cutters.
Yeah, that's literally happened in the last couple of days. They've made that official, even though me and Jack have been mates for a long time, so we're always chatting about things. But I think Cutters felt like they looked like they were caught on the hop, And I had done a little bit of work around it, but unfortunately I get zucked off Facebook all the time for reasons entirely unrelated to solar. So a lot of the time I'm not able to post. I think next time
You're a political activist, are you, Brendan?
Oh, maybe a little bit.
What's the longest time you've been in Facebook jail?
Oh, they put me in a 30-day jail now all the time. Once you've been done a couple of times, it appears that the algorithm just targets me now. So like my last one, I got put in jail for 30 days because I said Australians are stupid. At this stage, I think next time I get out of Facebook jail, I'm just going to have to just keep my posting to solar cutters and nothing else, and leave my online spats to Twitter. They're a bit.
But once Elon takes over, you can say fucking anything, man. We could keep going down that track. We could talk about the standards more and more, but I just want to bring it back to you. So, Brendan, personally, I actually remember the first time I met you. So we'd been working for Energy Matters, and Sun Edison came in and bought the business. At the time, they were the largest renewable developer, and they did their culture training. And we went to Creswick, and we did the one company, one culture training, Ocock.
Yeah.
I remember the first night they had like the silver service on the lawn, and it was a particularly boozy affair from what I remember. The first time.
We're all ex-Energy Matters alumni here. I was like one of the few people, I guess, in the business that was the next tradesman, and coming into this and Energy Matters was a great place to work. But when Sun Edison took over it, for the first time ever, I was exposed to this really professional corporate environment. Fair to say that doesn't suit me very well. And I just mostly got pissed and made a dick of myself. And I do remember the second morning walking in to the Ocock training, and I was in a terrible state. I was barely awake, right? Because we'd maybe gotten very boozed the night before. And this big American dude come up to me and says, "You taking this seriously?" I'm like, "Nah, not really, man." I think this is all just corporate wank. I mean, if you keep paying me, I'll turn up and do my job. But what do you want from me?
That's the thing. The American corporate rah-rah isn't necessarily compatible with Australian culture.
No, they wanted me to hand my firstborn over to Sun Edison. That wasn't happening. I'm good at my job. I'll turn up. I'll do my job. You don't have to blow sunshine up my ass. Just pay me.
Just pay me.
Just pay me. As long as I'm paid every week, I'll turn up and I'll do my job.
Don't care what the title on the door is, as long as you pay me. Yeah.
Yeah.
So after that, you had your contracting business, which was acquired by Gippsland Solar, I believe. Why did you make a pivot from installing, being on the tools, managing sites to training people?
Well, Gippsland Solar actually made me redundant at a pretty inopportune time around the start of the pandemic. And one of the reasons my business got bought is I did have a bit of a bad run. When I had my own contracting business, my business burnt to the ground.
Literally.
Literally got incinerated. And after that, to be honest, I was a bit I was probably at the lowest point I'd ever been in my career after that. I wasn't really sure what to do with myself.
That must have hurt a lot, Bruce. And our hearts went out to you at the time. I remember we sort of came to the rescue and did what we could for some inverters that you needed for an upcoming job. But at the end of the day, we were shattered for you.
Yeah, I mean, it was one of those things. It turns out insurance companies are a bunch of finarseholes, just in case you weren't aware. So, they strung me out for a long period of time and it all got a bit much, but then managed to sell the business to Gippsland Solar. I would say a good period of time, I was pretty disconnected from the industry. I just sort of had enough and wasn't really paying a lot of attention. And then when I got made redundant, I wasn't really sure what to do with myself. A bloke that I'd briefly worked with, Alroy from Online Air and Solar, I'd written the whole training program for RACV Solar. So that was the connection between Gippsland Solar and RACV. I'd actually done consultancy with RACV before the whole acquisition thing, helping them get their solar business started. So I'd actually trained all of RACV's subcontractors, and Online Air was one of those. And Alroy just rang me out of the blue. He said to me, "Mate, I hear you're not working. You were a really great trainer when you trained us. Do you want to come and be a teacher?" I'm like, "Mate, I'd never even considered it, never really thought about it." And they were just starting up an RTO, which is Energy Trading Group, so starting it from scratch. And I thought to myself, well, I've always enjoyed teaching, as a tradesman, I always enjoyed having apprentices around. There's lots of tradesmen I know that, they just sort of tolerate apprentices probably more than anything. I'd always enjoyed seeing my apprentices grow and become good tradesmen and become, great electricians. And I've got mates that were apprentices from 10 years ago, guys that I trained 10 years ago and I'm still friends with.
You're breaking my heart, Brendan. You're breaking my heart. At the end of the day, mate, this is almost every week we talk to the people that come on the show about mental health. And obviously this is an enormous struggle for you to, rise up out of that, having your shed burned down and equipment and gear and so on, and then a redundancy and a new opportunity and your love for apprentices and training people. Mate, this is a spectacular story of triumph.
I never really thought about it that way, but yeah, thanks. I don't take compliments well, I suppose.
That's true.
Oh, look,
it's
Brendan,
true, though. I agree.
the industry that we're in doesn't refer to itself as a solar coaster for no reason. We're not talking the Big Dipper. This is an unbelievable roller coaster when your shed burns down and when things change as dramatically as they have. You should be a model for others to have survived this. It's just incredible. I'm really proud of you, mate.
Thank you, Karl. I must say I have listened to a couple of your podcasts, and you do ask how do people do the balance thing, and I have heard that question a couple of times. I'm actually really happy now as a trainer. One of the big changes in being a trainer is that I'd always done project work. I'd been a project manager, a project engineer, a site manager. Projects have always got budgets and deadlines and pressure. As a trainer, it's just like this sort of ongoing rolling thing. There's no like hard deadlines. There's no hard budgets. It's like the pressure isn't there. And I know what I'm talking about. So the training is not difficult. I can stand in front of 10 blokes and talk about solar for 3 days straight without an issue. Like I've been doing it for 12 years. I want to know something by now. So I do find
the only drawback there, Brendan, is you're not a barrister. Those guys can charge $500 an hour and be absolutely fucking hopeless.
Let's not get into boys.
First-hand experience, totally. We'll talk about that after the show.
But the actual process of getting an RTO off the ground, and it must be a lot of work, yeah?
Yeah, so there's the Australian Skills and Qualifications Authority, ASQA, and they're essentially the same as the regulator, like the ESV are in Victoria for electricians. It took Alroy. I came in a little bit later onto the piece, but the process took me 2 years to get to the point where we were a registered training organisation to get your RTO number. It's quite capital intensive too. You've got to be audited to be able to get your RTO. But to be audited, you've got to have everything in place. So you can get everything in place, and then it might take 12 months for you to get through the audits. And in the meantime, you've built a classroom, you've got inverters and batteries hanging on the wall, you've got rooftops, we've got all these things sitting there, and you're not making a single dollar off it. It's just sitting there for 12 months while ASQA go through the process of ticking you off to give, because you got to prove to them that you have the capability to deliver courses. All this capital just sits there for quite a long period of time before you.
Not to mention paying your wages along the way, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So in this situation, I'm an employee, so it's not my business, but it's not cheap, and it does take a long time to get an RTO off the ground. That's something that I've learned, and there's a lot that goes on in the back end to maintain your RTO number.
What's the scope of training that you do?
At this stage, we're offering the solar PV course and the solar with batteries, the grid connected course. We're on the cusp of offering the disconnect reconnect for plumbers. That's come into a lot of demand because of the Victorian rebate around replacing gas hot water services and gas appliances. So that's in high demand. We will offer the white card, mostly because that's money for jam, if I'm honest. And when we move to a new premise in Epping, probably later this year, but I believe the next course we'll look at offering will be the Working at Heights course, just so you can come to one place and get everything you need for the solar industry. At this stage, we don't offer it because you need a platform and you need some like.
So once again, more money to lay down just to actually be able to offer it. So
yeah, I mean you've got to like literally build like scaffolds and all sorts of stuff so guys can hang off ropes and things like that, so you can do the Working at Heights course. So when we move to a new premise, we'll look at developing that, and then we'll offer the Working at Heights course. But yeah, we're hopefully looking to start doing a few like webinars. I mean, I've been getting a lot of questions about CPD points and developing some courses to get CPD points for guys, because CEC are charging for it now. So I do find it punishes the old hands a little bit, because like I know to get my CPD points, I used to just log into the website, you punch out a couple of webinars, and there's my points. Because I've been accredited for over a decade now, you can't do any of them twice, even though I've got more knowledge and more experience than most. it's harder for me to get my CPD points than it is for a guy who's freshly accredited, because I can't do any of the courses twice. I've got to go and find something new every year, which can be a little bit tricky. So
that is coming up quite a lot. As in, there are whilst you say, oh, it's the old hands. Well, that's what I see on the various forums. It's the old hands that are saying, hey, look, what am I going to do here?
Yeah, and they're the guys that probably need it the least. Yeah.
Now, gents, that's all we've got time for. I'll just say that there's some whispers of a Energy Matters alumni gathering around All Energy coming up in October, which would be good. So continue the conversation there. But yeah, Brendan Laidlaw from the Energy Training Group, aka Knackers, mate, it's been great to catch up. Thanks for coming on today.
It's been good to have a chat, boys. Always appreciate a chat with you fellas.
Thank you very much for coming on the show today. It's been utterly inspirational that you've managed to struggle through the last couple of years, and you're an inspiration to the whole industry, mate. Thank you.
Thanks, Karl. I do appreciate that, mate. It's I don't take compliments well, but thank you.
No worries, man. So thanks again for coming on. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe, share it around to anyone who might get benefit. Thanks again.